Hi, I'm Ben Willis, contributing editor with Tax Notes here in Silver Spring, Maryland.
I'm Joe Thorndike. I'm a contributing editor with Tax Notes Federal and a historian with the Tax History Project at Tax Analysts. I'm here in Charlottesville, Virginia today.
Today we're here to talk about the tax history related to the federal government's use of military force to deal with protests, a subject I know Joe is familiar with. While not the focus of today's discussion, recent events have inspired it. With an African-American wife and son, I am often asked about and am personally affected by the long-standing frustrations about police brutality and racial inequality that led to the current protests. I must take a moment to acknowledge those who have suffered from the recent events and share my deep empathy for them. With that said, Joe, could you please share with us your historic perspective on the use of military force in dealing with protests?
Yeah, sure. So, there's been a lot of talk this last week about the use of federal troops for domestic law enforcement. I think that was occasioned originally by President Trump's Rose Garden talk when he made an allusion to the Insurrection Act of 1807, which does authorize the president to use that force sometimes. And then later by Senator Tom Cotton's op-ed in the New York Times, call out the troops, in which he suggested the same thing, that the federal government should use military force to quiet the riots or the protests in American cities. Those are pretty controversial. And one of the things that Cotton says in his op-ed is that this has been done dozens of times in American history. And I don't have an exact count, but he's certainly right that it's happened before. There have been numerous times when presidents have used federal troops to suppress U.S. citizens in certain situations. And it goes way back. You can find, Andrew Jackson doing it, and Rutherford Hayes, and Cleveland and Harding and Hoover. I mean, there's a long list, and most of the time it was for to put down organized labor actions. And other times it's been used for domestic disturbances and riots, like in the LA riots in, I think it was 1992. But for our purposes here at Tax Notes, I think it's important to say that the very first time that the federal government used military force to put down an insurrection or a riot or some sort of domestic disturbance was for the enforcement of a tax law. It was for that thing that we all learned about at some point in high school or whatever. It was for the Whiskey Rebellion, the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794, when George Washington takes 13,000 federal troops and climbs up on his horse for the first time since the Revolution, and actually marches them into Western Pennsylvania, or what today is now Western Pennsylvania. That at the time was the Western frontier. And that was the very first time. I think it's a story that's worth telling, and we can learn some things from it. The question exactly, and I think we'll get into this later, is what exactly are we going to learn from that?
Well, that sounds like it's going to be a very interesting discussion. I know folks listening are wondering the history of the federal use, are curious, and the fact that it ties so deeply with tax, I believe is relevant to all of our listeners. And so
yeah,
I'm certainly interested to hear more. Joe, please.
Yeah, well, it's like this iconic event, right? We all know something about the Whiskey Rebellion, like we know that it happened, but we don't necessarily know all that much about it. Here's the sort of like nutshell version of it. It unfolds between 1791 and 1794. It starts small, just a few disorganized actions. It gets much bigger and much better organized, in which there are sort of real sort of quasi-military forces moving around on the Western frontier. It's reasonable to describe it as a serious threat to the young nation. The U.S. is just barely a country at that point, and it's a threat to the nation's integrity. There's talk about secession. It's a national security threat, and among other things, it's a threat to the nation's fiscal capacity, because it's all hinging, or it's all turning on this tax, this new tax, a relatively narrow tax imposed in 1791 on distilled spirits. And this is important because this is the first domestic tax imposed by the new federal government. Until then, they'd only been raising money through tariff duties. This is the first time that the federal government has tried to raise money by taxing something produced in the U.S. and that's consumed in the U.S. The tax was designed as part of Alexander Hamilton's economic program, in which his intention, you have probably heard this before, his plan was that the federal government would assume the debts of the states that they had incurred during the Revolution, and then and assume that, make them federal debts, and then the federal government would fund this new larger debt on a sort of ongoing basis. It wasn't really about paying off that debt so much as in just having a debt and paying the interest on it in a reliable fashion. There's a historian of the Whiskey Rebellion. I think he's really the best historian who's told the story most recently and best. His name is William Hoagland. And he's pointed out that the key here is, in fact, that Hamilton didn't really intend to pay off that debt. What he really intended to do was to develop a class of bondholders, people who are lending that money to the federal government, who are sort of invested both literally and figuratively in the success of that government. So if he can say to them, yeah, I can guarantee you, you're going to get your money. We're going to send you that check regularly on these bonds. That those guys would be invested in making sure that the federal government continues to exist. So he believed that this was for the good of the country. And in order to make sure that we could pay that interest, that we could fund that debt, he thought the best way to do that was to raise money from, among other things, these farmers on the western frontier who were distilling whiskey. And so they create this whiskey tax. The tax is, as I said, fairly narrow, but it's really quite heavy. It ranges, what these numbers don't really mean anything when translated to today, but they're from 9 to 25 cents a gallon, depending on alcohol content. But that's actually a lot of money at the time, and it amounts to as much as a full day's wages per gallon. And the tax is structured in such a way, we don't need to get into the details, that it's much easier to bear for large urban distillers than it is for the little guys on the frontier. And those little guys on the frontier can't really afford to pass on the cost to their consumers. And on top of that, they can't really afford, they have to keep distilling whiskey because it's the only way that they can get their crops to market. They can grow things, but you can't take these crops and move them up over the mountains and bring them to the East Coast. You need to distill them into a more transportable form like whiskey. And so Hamilton decides to tax the thing that they need most, the one thing that they can actually bring to market. And in fact, and not only do they bring it to market, but it's actually used as a form of currency a lot of the time, because there is not always a lot of currency on the frontier. So this is a really burdensome tax for these little guys. And on top of that, the way it's enforced is very burdensome. They have federal tax collectors with a lot of power. They have the power to they can enter any building anytime they want to inspect it and see what's going on. If they find problems, they can levy ruinous fines on these people. And they can also confiscate their materials and not just the goods that they're producing, but all of the things that they're using to produce it. So it's a very heavy-handed tax with federal officials too. So this is very irritating at the very least. Threatening is probably a better way of putting it for these little guys. And so I think that sort of gives you the sense of like what the contest is here. It's these little farmers out west who, and I wrote about this recently for Tax Notes, who feel very much like this is a tax imposed by other people for the good of other people, and it's not for their good at all. It's a betrayal of everything that they thought the revolution was about. It's not their tax, right? It's an imposition, and it feels very foreign to them. And their attachment to the union is pretty tenuous to begin with. I mean, the union's brand new. So and on the Western frontier, it's especially tenuous out there. These guys are thinking maybe we're not that into it. And so that's the sort of origin of why they start to revolt. And they revolt with like the typical sorts of revolt techniques of the day. They tar and feather the tax guy. They actually, mount an armed insurrection.
Let me stop you there because I'm curious to hear more about exactly what they did in response to this tax. But just to step back for a moment, it does in fact seem like this tax is incredibly oppressive on these individuals who can barely pay it. I mean, as you said it's almost a day's wages for the amount. And so What was Alexander Hamilton's policy behind the tax? Obviously, it's whiskey. I don't know if the policies behind many sin taxes were existent at that time and supported the view there, or was there something else?
He honestly, Hamilton doesn't actually care very much about the little guy. I mean, he is an unapologetic elitist, and he's also a believer in the idea that the future of the country's prosperity and honestly its territorial integrity, its survival, really depends on it being a commercial and industrial enterprise, not a nation of small farmers. That's the sort of, Jeffersonian vision of what of what America should be, but that is not what Hamilton thought it should be. And so this tax was designed quite consciously to burden the little distiller and not the big distiller, because he was basically fine with big distillers. No one wants anyone to stop drinking whiskey. We just don't need those little guys out there distilling the whiskey. So he's perfectly happy if the net effect of this tax is to drive the little guys out of business and to create quasi-monopolies, oligopolies of whiskey distillers in the big cities. That's okay with him. And that is, we may not like that view of Hamilton, but I mean, Hamilton is, as I said, sort of unapologetic about that. He believes that kind of industrial consolidation is a good thing and good for the country. And he also understands that this tax is going to be used to enrich a bondholding class, but that's a feature, not a bug, for him. You need the bondholding class to be rich and to be enriched by the system so that they are invested in the system. We can make this sound nefarious if we want to. We can also make it sound wise if we want to. It depends really on the politics you bring to the story, ahead of time. If your sympathies are typically going to go to the little guy, to the working class, then this is going to be kind of outrageous for you. And certainly many historians feel like this was pretty outrageous, the way that he was prepared to victimize, if you want to put it that way, the little guy for the sake of the big guy. But a lot of other people, and I think sort of the more traditional old-fashioned view of Hamilton is, hey, you know what? He knew what needed to be done. The country was on tenuous financial footing. He understood what had to happen here, that we needed to have these rich guys invested in the country and behind it, and he did what he had to do. And I think that like most historical situations, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. There probably were difficult decisions that needed to be made. Whether he needed to sacrifice the interests of the little guy as much as he did, or as completely as he did, or with as much reckless abandon as he did, well, maybe not. But that it's also undeniable that he achieved something quite significant in putting the U.S. on a solid economic fiscal foundation.
So Joe, how did the farmers handle these oppressive tax collectors? One, how did the tax collectors go about collecting the tax? Two, how did they respond to that, which I believe you began mentioning earlier? And then three, to this point about underlying views and who bears the burden here, do you think this was foreseen by Alexander Hamilton? Do you think he knew what would happen when he imposed these taxes?
Well, so the tax proved to be basically uncollectible on the frontier, because the people who became the whiskey rebels, and incidentally, it was really Hamilton who popularized that way of thinking about them, that they made life impossible for the tax collectors, and it wasn't really a viable tax because there was no buy-in at all from the taxpayers. So how did they accomplish that? Well, they just they literally and figuratively tortured the tax collectors. They just made it impossible to be a tax collector on the frontier, and it's easy to do that, in a community if you are just ruthless about it. So tarring and feathering is funny, right? You see it in cartoons, actually brutal and extremely violent, and these were violent people, the rebels. And it prompted a violent reaction from the federal government. Now, I think that some historians tend to think that Hamilton was more than happy to see that violent reaction because he had a militaristic streak and in his personality, and that the idea of suppressing this rebellion was appealing to him. Actually, the Western frontier was problematic for the young nation in a variety of ways, as I alluded to before. The Union was young, and the attachment of the frontier areas to the new government was sometimes tenuous, and having the opportunity to establish the government's authority and sovereignty in its new territory, there's some value in that if you are a nationalist at the time. And so it's possible some historians look at this and they say, yeah, I mean, Hamilton was perfectly happy to see them rebel so that he had the opportunity to march this army in. I think in strongly stated, that kind of view strikes me as a little exaggerated. But I do think that I do think he was unconcerned. Let's give it the most charitable view I can. I think he was unconcerned with how burdensome this tax was on the little guy. I think when the little guys objected, he was probably not especially surprised and perfectly content to try to enforce it with overwhelming force, to try to make good on the tax with military force. I don't think that he was tortured by that idea. And in fact, it does seem fairly clear that as soon as it became obvious that they were going to resist this tax, he started agitating pretty quickly and pretty actively for pulling the troops together and marching them out into Pennsylvania. So I don't think that this was a painful decision. I hate to do this to my fellow countrymen. I think he was, Hamilton was a guy who wanted to make a point, and his point here, I think, in part was, this is our country. We have the authority here, and I think also in a tax sense, he wanted to establish once and for all that the federal government would make good on its power to tax. That's not a given, right? In 1790s, we'd just fought a revolution, which had a lot to do with who has the power to tax. Can we tax internally or not? Because these are live issues in the 1790s, and having an opportunity to answer that question decisively, I think that strikes me as something Hamilton was happy to do. Happy might be too strong a word, but that he saw virtues in doing that. So I can't quite go as far as the conspiracy-minded who say, yeah, I think Hamilton engineered the whole thing so that he could march an army into Western Pennsylvania. But I think that when it became obvious that he had a problem in Western Pennsylvania, he was more than happy to convince Washington that an army was the right answer.
Is it fair for some to use this history to argue that the federal government has a history of using military to show its force to strengthen its own political agenda? At the time, perhaps it would have been just to show that a new union has been formed, a new government exists, and we are no longer as separate as we historically had been. But you could see that some might try to analogize that to current events and say where someone wants to, have a show of force to, support whatever base or contingency they're trying to. Could they point to this history for that under today's times?
Yeah, I certainly think people are trying to do that. I think that analogies with history are dangerous things, and most historians resist them because the truth is the situations tend to be historically unique. They are specific to every situation is specific. And to try to look back and say, if the basic argument here is something like, hey, look, they did it then, so it should be okay to do now, right? That's a specious argument. That why they did it then and why you might want to do something now are really not related to each other in any meaningful way. There are too many independent variables. There are too many things, too many moving pieces in this. And in fact, marching the army into Western Pennsylvania in 1794 is a controversial decision in 1794. And it's not like everyone's like, oh yeah, cool, no problem, go ahead and do it. And that you're gonna now trade on that. And it's not even true that since then everyone's looked at it and been like, yeah, uncomplicated. That's not, it's not the way it went then. It wasn't morally clear then, and it's not morally clear now. So I just don't think that I don't think history provides a moral license in any way. Even if the past event does appear to be sort of morally clear, it doesn't make the next one, it doesn't lend that moral legitimacy to the next event. You have to engage them each independently. So I think the point here is not, hey, Washington did it, so it's totally cool if the president wants to do it now. I think, no, it might not have been cool when Washington did it, and we want to argue about that on its own terms. And it might not be cool if we do it right now either, and we should argue about that on its own terms. The history just informs our understanding of the whole thing. And I think that is really the key here, is that it doesn't provide easy answers. It doesn't provide simple formulas. It's certainly not predictive of how it's going to turn out. Like, hey, it worked out well in the Whiskey Rebellion, should be fine now. It doesn't do that either. It just tells us what we can see is, hey, there was an argument about this. People weren't necessarily comfortable with the idea of suppressing a domestic insurrection with the army. And people probably aren't comfortable now with the idea of using the army to suppress riots or protests. And so I just think I'm uncomfortable as a historian with the idea that we're going to use history as in that sort of instrumental way, that we're going to use it as a defense or as a justification for something now.
It's helpful to hear that, especially because there are so many people right now who are looking to grasp at something to justify positions on all sides. And
Right.
and as you know, we have so much to learn from history, but there are certainly limitations on trying to apply that history, which you've informed us of, to
Yeah.
current events. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Are there any lessons, key takeaways from the history of the Whiskey Rebellion that you think are especially important for tax folks to be aware of, or just interesting or insightful?
Well, the one that I keep coming back to is that I think that you need taxes to be, people need to recognize taxes as their own in some way. And when I say that, what I mean is they need to recognize that these are taxes that were enacted by them or their representatives and for them, for their sake, for their good, for the general good. And that when you often run into problems when you have taxes that don't seem to do that, that seem to be imposed by people who aren't listening to what your needs are, to what the voters' needs are, to what the citizens' needs are. And that tax will start to feel foreign or alien. That's certainly what happens in the Revolution, right? Where Great Britain is imposing taxes which the colonists feel are for the good of Great Britain and not for the people in the colonies. And it's, I think, what happens in the Whiskey Rebellion too, where they feel very much like the federal government is acting like Great Britain had acted. It's imposing taxes for its own purposes and sort of just, without regard for the people who are actually paying those taxes. And I think that there are perhaps lessons in that for the way we think about taxes now, which is that we need to make sure that when we design taxes, we make people feel some sense of ownership over those taxes. Like these are their taxes. They're not other people's taxes that are imposed on them.
Well, that's I can see that being very helpful to a lot of listeners and individuals right now. I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of debates going on as to who ultimately will bear the burden of some of the expenses that are going on today, and
Mm-hmm.
who the government should be assisting most. And with
Right.
respect to the epidemic and recent pandemic that caused so much economic concerns. And so hopefully there is a consensus among the citizens that is appreciated by lawmakers and taken into account to prevent
Yeah.
events in the past that you just mentioned. So,
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's been fantastic chatting with you about this topic. It's very intriguing, and I appreciate you taking the time to share these insights with us.
Hey, my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Have a good one, Joe.
You too.
Thanks.